This video is going to be about swapping the alternator on your Dodge Grand Caravan. Fairly straightforward, with one caveat is in order to get the alternator out you have to remove the EGR valve, and ironically, if you ever need to remove the EGR valve, you have to also remove the alternator. And I'm going to show you a little trick to get around that for the future. Okay, I missed a step on making the video, so here, let me try to explain what's going on. The reason why you have to remove both the EGR and the alternator to replace either the EGR or the alternator is because of the lower bolt on the EGR that's tucked down here. It's actually blocked by the alternator, so you can't get at that bolt. Now, if you're just replacing the alternator is bad, you can't get this alternator out of here because the EGR is in the way. So it's catch-22. You have to remove the alternator, the EGR, to get the alternator out of there, but you have to remove the alternator to access the bolt on the EGR. So what we will be doing, or what I will show here in this video, and hopefully with the patchwork of putting it together you'll understand, is we're going to get the alternator unbolted, and then after it's unbolted we're just going to drop it down into this pocket here. It's only going to drop maybe 4 or 6 inches down into there and just sit there loosely. That will give us access to this lower bolt, and then we'll be able to get this EGR valve moved out of the way to lift the alternator out of there and get that replaced, because for this video that's actually where the real problem is. But I have had to replace both of them, and that is why we're going to replace the bolts. I'm going to just do them both, but it's really that lower one gets replaced from, instead of just a regular old socket bolt, we're going to put in a cap screw, which has a much smaller head. And in the future, if I needed to replace this alternator, I could just get in there with the Allen wrench, undo that cap screw, and lift this the EGR valve. If I need to replace the EGR valve, I'll be able to get in there with an Allen T-handle Allen or a Allen socket, undo that cap screw, lift this EGR valve out. These EGR valves are known to fail. Some vehicles, California emissions, will not have this EGR valve, but it's actually up in here. I guess because it's attached to the exhaust system, it gets very hot, and there's a ribbon cable in there that wears out. So these fail fairly regularly. So just to clarify, and now back to the video. You're going to want to pick up some class 12.9, these are called cap screws, and they're M8 by 1.25 by thread. I guess that's, the length is 25 millimeters, I suppose. And pick up the hardened washers M8 to go onto these. And the reason why we're going to swap this out is if you ever need to change your EGR, and that's if you have an EGR. When it fails, you'll be able to remove the EGR without having to remove the alternator in the process also. Okay, now you got to undo your wire harnesses for the EGR valve, and there's 2 on the alternator. And first there's the EGR valve. Do that first, and you have to undo that clip. I've undone it before, so it's easier. You may have to use a screwdriver, but take note of how that clip unlocks that. Once that's unlocked, then you can squeeze this and pull this socket off. The main power terminal for your alternator is a 13 millimeter bolt, 13 millimeter nut, so you're going to need to use a socket. I used my breaker bar on that with a 13 millimeter socket, and then that comes off. And then down below here is another terminal, which I've already undone, has a lock like that on there. But Chrysler, in their infinite wisdom, put it on the bottom where you can't see it. So don't let that cause you a headache. Don't grab a pair of vice grips to yank this thing off. If you look from underneath, you'll be able to see it. I had to reach up with a long extended screwdriver to pop that lock open, and then once that's done, you'll be able to pull it off, and you see the lock there. So watch out for that. Jack up the passenger side of the car and remove your plastic cover. This tool is worth the investment, definitely, to remove those buttons. I'm using that all the time. You're going to need your belt removal tool to loosen up the belt. I just use this half along with my breaker bar. That works out real well. This is your tensioner right here, and that's what you're going to flex backwards to release the belt. And your tool is made to fit in there, and I'll put my breaker bar into the socket there, and allows you to flex. The leverage will allow you to flex this back, and you pull the belt off the alternator or off this pulley down here. And you could also put a large open-end wrench there, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of room to work. If you're lucky, some of them will have a second box socket back here that you can actually flex the tensioner from above, and you don't have to do it from below. And so keep an eye out for that. Could make it a little easier for you. Okay, the belt's off. Now we have to undo the bolts, and I'll show you which ones to do. There's one up here, one directly below it, and then there's one tucked down there. And let me show you what order you want to do them in. Okay, looking down at your alternator, this is the view you'll have. You have a bolt up here. You have a bolt below it that's easiest to reach from underneath. You can't really see it, you'll just have to get it by feel. And then down here there's a third bolt that faces the radiator. The order you want to do it, you want to loosen all three of them up, just crack loose, so just that they're starting to loosen. And then you want to attack this one first, because if the other two are loose, this one's going to really fight you, and this one's hard to get to. So you'll do that one first, and that one, after you get it broken pretty loose, you can usually spin it out by hand. Then go after this bottom one, and then you can get this top one from above, and that way you have two hands to work on it also, because sometimes you have to shimmy the alternator around, because at that point the weight is pulling down on it. Word of caution. It's 10mm bolts holding this EGR valve on. Sometimes they can be real tight in there, and you don't want to break them off. So, for instance, it's about 45 degrees this morning out here. Put some pressure, use a breaker bar, put some pressure on it. If it doesn't want to move, start your engine, let it start warming up, expanding this metal, and then as my engine was running, I actually kept just putting steady pressure on it to feel it. Finally it cracked loose, and I was able to start nudging it forward a little bit at a time. Unfortunately, you can't reach the lower one, so I have to take the alternator off real quick while this is still warm in order to break that other one loose. These lower EGR valve bolts are metric 9.8, comparable to SAE. That is, SAE would be grade 5, which is a soft bolt. So these bolts can snap off on you. So be very, very careful when breaking them loose. Just do steady pressure on it, keep the pressure on until it starts to nudge forward. Don't try forcing it. Okay, you'll remove the two 8mm screws that are holding the top of this EGR valve assembly in place, and then once everything's disconnected, you'll be able to lift this up, swing it out of the way, and just park it over here out of your way. You don't have to undo these cables or the other half of this pipe. You can if you want to, but I just swung it out of the way. And when you remove your EGR valve, be sure to catch the metal gasket that's in there so you can reuse it so you don't lose it. So now you're going to take your replacement alternator, and you're going to drop it down into the pocket there on an angle, and then we're going to put the EGR valve back on. Okay, I have my cap screws, and I'm going to slop them up with anti-seize, and I'm going to use a 6mm T-handle to tighten them down. Would be a good idea to use a ratchet with an Allen key socket, but you will need a long one. Unfortunately, all I have is a short one, so I'll go to Harbor Freight, buy them, and tighten them down a little tighter with a ratchet later. Okay, that's ready to go in. EGR is in place. I just tightened it down with nothing but the T-handle, and I think that's plenty tight enough. I've done this before with nothing but that same T-handle, and it worked out just fine. Okay, and to put it back on, we're going to do reverse order. Get this bolt in place first so it's just barely loose, so you have a little bit of wiggle room. Then get the bottom bolt, and then get that one threaded in, and then after all three are done, tighten all three down. Next step will be to hang the alternator in place with this top bolt. And initially you're going to find it easier to use just one of these round drivers along with a deep socket to just hand screw the upper and lower bolt in place. Then after that's in place, we'll go for that bottom bolt down there, because if you don't have anything supporting this alternator, you'll find it a real bugger to work with. So we'll get these two, and just leave a little bit of wiggle room in there in case you have to wiggle it back and forth to get that bolt started, because that one down there you have to tighten that on with an open-end wrench, or if you have a ratcheting box wrench, which I do in every size except 15, that would be a godsend to use down in that tight little spot. Okay, so I've tightened down the two screws holding the top plate, the EGR valve, into place. That screws into plastic, so don't go killing it. Next step, reattach my harnesses. Working from the bottom up. If that plug's not in all the way, you'll know because you won't be able to lock it. There we go, there. That goes in there. I'll tighten my 13mm nut onto there, and then this goes in place and locked. Okay, I have everything tightened down, reconnected, everything's good. I pulled the pulley up and put it over, pulled the belt up and put it over top the pulley of the alternator. Now I'll get under the car and reset the belt. Okay, this is how I like to get the belt preset, and then I'll pull back on the tensioner. I only have two hands, so I can't hold the camera and do it at the same time. But after you pull it back, you just throw the belt onto the pulley of the AC compressor, and then just double check that they're all seated right all along the path of the belt. Okay, belt's on. I'll put the plastic cover back on after I start the engine and double check that everything's good, and then I'm ready to be back on the road. Okay, so all done. Running. Actually been running for about a year now since I made this video. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thanks.